Welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark, the radio show where we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan, and sometimes even across Canada, to see what lies within. I'm your host, K.D. Kulpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher based here in Regina. Tonight we're diving back into this history of paranormal investigations, more specifically the history of one of the common pieces of equipment that you see used in investigations wherever you watch them. And so in this episode, we're actually going to be talking about the history and significance of EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena. Alright, so if you've watched any of the popular ghost shows on TV or on YouTube, then you have likely heard about EVPs somewhere along the way, or seen the little digital recorders that are typically used. Now, there are very many variations on how the supposed evidence of ghosts, is collected. Some use recorders, some use speakers that are hooked up to, the radio static or the white noise to supposedly give the ghost a voice. What I was wondering, however, was what is the actual science behind what these show hosts are trying to do? Like, where did this idea come from? And, how are they proving that this is actually a ghost and not something else? So before we get into too much of that, let's first dive into just where this phenomenon started. So the concept of EVP actually dates back to the early 20th century with pioneers like, oh my goodness, I'm so going to get these names wrong, by the way, Attila von Szalay, Frederick Jurgensen, and Konstantin Rodiv. We already talked a bit about this time period previously when we talked about, the early paranormal investigations and early parapsychology movement of the 19th and 20th centuries. And as you know, around that time, mediums were primarily the ones communicating with the dead. But things like spirit photography were also starting to gain popularity, of course, along with many of the hoaxes, right? But in 1941, Attila was an American photographer that has been identified as possibly the very first person to record an actual paranormal voice. So an unexplained voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave. At this time, he was using a 78 RPM record and later switched to a magnetophone, which is a reel-to-reel tape recorder. So Frederick was born in Russia and was a painter, so this is, somebody else, and a film producer. And then there was Konstantin, which was a Latvian psychologist and parapsychologist. So Frederick and Konstantin actually met in 1965, and this was after Frederick had pioneered the early investigations into EVPs. Apparently, it all started with him hearing what sounded like a human voice while he was recording finches, so the birds. He was trying to record their songs and ended up walking away with voices that he hadn't heard while he was recording. So when he actually studied the recording further, he was convinced that the human voice on the recording was actually his dead mother trying to leave him a message from beyond the veil. So that kind of is what started him going down this path. Now, once they connected, this is Konstantin and Frederick. Once they connected and started to collaborate on further research into this whole idea of being able to record paranormal voices, which back then I believe is also known as the Rodiv voices, they would go on to collect and analyze actually over 100,000 recordings. And Rodiv even went on to write a book in 1968, not in English originally, but eventually it was translated to English. And so you can actually find it even now, and it's called Breakthrough, An Amazing Experience in Electronic Communication with the Dead. So according to his research, Rodiv believed that the deceased end up living in kind of this opposed world, or on a different level of reality that we as humans are unable to see or communicate with on a regular basis. However, somehow, I guess, in his opinion, the reel-to-reel tape recordings, or, digital recorders nowadays, are somehow able to still pick up on their voices and, make it possible for us to communicate through the realms. Now, other parapsychologists and engineers have eventually did join, these first few pioneers into EVPs, I guess you could call them. And even his wife ended up joining in as they continued to collect recordings of ghostly voices. So these voices were originally caught on, your standard tape recorder, but they could also collect voices from white noise of certain radio stations. Of course, a lot of these findings have been under a lot of controversy, just like anything in the paranormal, as the voices are sometimes speaking in different languages. So, because it was a different language and because radio waves were so big back then and so new, this did make speculators kind of wondering if the researchers were actually just picking up radio waves from international locations, and that's why they were, showing up in different languages. Now, as recording equipment continued to evolve, and the technology changed as technology does so quickly, those interested in the paranormal continued to expand their research using this newer technology. So, as mentioned earlier, they were first using kind of these reel-to-reel tape recorders, or the magnetophone. I hope I said that right. These were commonly used in kind of that magnetic area from 1945 to 1975, at least this is according to Wikipedia. In 1952, the endless loop tape cartridge was invented, so, and then the cassette tape, which is an analog magnetic tape recorder in 1963. So obviously, as the technology kept improving, they kept trying to continue this research using the different things. But in 1979, it was kind of the first actual, at least as far as I could tell, it was the first actual device created specifically for trying to capture EVPs. And that was by George Meeks and Bill O'Neill. So they actually built something called the Spiricom. And it was a massive radio-like device with 13 tone generators. However, later, the device's ability to capture conversations from spirits could not be replicated. So, of course, in the science community, if you can't replicate something, it kind of just gets debunked or, said that it's false or made up or fake or whatever it is. So, and actually, they claim that eventually this device was actually debunked on a television series called Ghost Hunters. I think they said it was in like 2020 or is, fairly recently, that this specific device was debunked. However, another device was created again specifically for use with ghost hunting and hearing voices, and this was the Frank's box. So the Frank's box was created by Frank Sumpton in 2002. Which inspired kind of the newer versions of this kind of device. So this would be like your spirit box if you watch paranormal investigation shows, or your ghost box. So, the ones that are really loud radio waves coming through, that they're like, what do they say? They're spanning through radio waves. And somehow voices are able to use the white noise or the radio frequencies to talk. So that is how this particular device supposedly is used, is sweeping through these radio frequencies or this white noise. Again, many argue that this actually leads to inaccurate results or just broken radio voices coming through that are being mistaken as spirits, which I kind of can get why people are saying that kind of thing. So nowadays, there's even more. So you have digital recorders, of course, and you will probably see them all over any sort of paranormal investigation shows, whether you watch them on television series, whether you watch them on YouTube. You will see them holding little digital devices of various kinds. Again, still a lot of debate around the accuracy and legitimacy of this particular form of pseudoscience, because the collection of EVPs is considered a pseudoscience in the scientific community. But in 1972, that didn't stop Sarah Estep from founding the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena, along with a group of others. I think they have a new name now. I don't think they go by that name anymore, but they are still around. And their hope was to collect actual objective evidence of, ghosts in the afterlife by collecting real EVPs, by, really being scientific around it. And apparently there have been numerous ways to hear these EVPs. So not just through the tape recorders or the spirit boxes or the digital recorders, but they've even tested devices like fax machines, television sets, which makes me think of, what show is it? where the girl goes into the television set. Poltergeist, I think it was called. Anyway, apparently everything has been tested, even computers. They try to use computers to let ghosts come through and kind of talk to us. But one parapsychologist in particular, in the late 1970s, even claimed that people were reporting receiving phone calls from the dead on their landline telephones. So actually getting phone calls from the dead. So even though the science community considers the collection of EVPs a pseudoscience, there are still some scientists trying to prove that this is a legitimate way to communicate with, those beyond our realm. So in realms that we cannot see. Whether that's, ghosts, aliens, or some other sort of beings. And in these studies, the people conducting the EVP sessions actually sit in a recording room or a screen chamber. These rooms allow minimal background noise, and in some cases are even shielded from radio interference, which I think is a really interesting way to do these experiments. I wish I, knew about them earlier. Now, what you might not know about me is that I actually come from a science and engineering background, and I had spent many, many years working as a research scientist in the environmental and geotechnical fields. So that is why the science of this stuff, I find it just absolutely fascinating. And I didn't realize that they were actually conducting these scientific experiments to this day, trying to communicate via something as simple as an EVP. So you can actually find research papers, and I'll link some in the article that I put on my Patreon. But I would love to be involved in some of these experiences, wouldn't you? Like getting to do an experiment with actual scientists trying to research the ability to talk to whoever, the ghosts, the aliens, whatever's on the other side of the EVP. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. So, any listeners, if you know someone researching this that need an extra set of hands, an extra scientist, make sure they look me up. But getting back to the topic at hand, even with the larger debate over what the recordings actually indicate, so whether it's actually voices or something else, these voices have actually been heard even in these very controlled environments. And the operators of the recorders are never alone in the screened room. They're either monitored, through a recording room or monitored with someone in the room with them. And so while they are conducting the session, they are being monitored. So it's made sure that they're not creating false evidence. And sessions are typically held for 15 to 30 minutes at a time, with questions being asked followed by the period of silence. So similar to what you would see, on your paranormal investigation episode. But obviously over a much longer time, because they don't have that much time to show you all of that on the television show. And not only have voices been captured in this manner, but sometimes they actually even come directly through the speaker. So not even, listened to later on in a recording, but actual direct voices coming through the speaker in these cases, which that I find fascinating, because if you're in such a controlled environment where, there's no radio signals or anything like that could potentially interfere, and something suddenly comes out of your speaker, that's pretty cool. Now, what I found particularly interesting in the research papers that I kind of read on this topic is that even the scientists find that if you focus on the experiment, like you are focusing on, I need to collect EVPs, I need to ask the right questions, I need to be super focused on this particular experiment, the voices tended to not speak. There tended to be silence. There tended to be not much coming through. However, as soon as the speaker or like the people doing the experiment were relaxed and were calm and were, chatting amongst themselves and not focused solely on the experiment, suddenly they would start getting voices come through, which seems to be a common experience, because all of the paranormal investigators that I've chatted to, they say that it's usually in between takes when the cameras are not like specifically turned on to capture something specific and they're just sitting and chatting with each other. That's when they get the most activity. It's not when they have all the equipment on and they're specifically trying to search for activity. It's the in-between stuff is when everything seems to happen. So I thought that was kind of interesting that even the scientists find that, same experience. Although there have been many cases that have been debunked due to either natural causes or outright hoaxes. So it's hard to say how much of the televised versions of these so-called paranormal experiments are real, but let's talk a little bit about kind of the explanations that the science community have given for, their reasoning behind calling this area a pseudoscience. So you might be able to tell just from how the experiments are run, how we talked about the different scientific studies being done in these specific rooms, kind of what the typical claims for EVPs are. And that is one of the biggest explanations is radio interference. This is especially the case for like spirit boxes that use the AM, FM radio waves or white noise to give the ghosts a voice, or so the claim goes. And if you've watched any of the paranormal investigation TV shows or popular YouTube channels, you will have seen these in use. So you might be like me and kind of wonder, if are these voices they claim to be real ghosts? Are they just actually weird radio message getting picked up randomly from the sweeping through the stations? I find especially when the voices seem completely random or like just make no sense to the conversation, my mind kind of leans toward the weird random voice picked up from the radio waves, not, necessarily a ghost. Now, we can see why the scientists trying to legitimately study this make sure those screened rooms don't allow radio wave interferences. They're trying to prove, that this is not what's actually happening. They do sometimes do some white noise, it looked like. But I don't know. I didn't dig into, the comparison between how many voices come through without white noise versus how many voices come through when there is white noise. That would probably be a whole other episode if I decided to do one. But I did find it interesting. And then, of course, there's another explanation for the voices that people claim to hear through these recordings. And that's auditory pareidolia, I think it's called. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I'm not sure. But so the claim here is, and you know what? I actually believe this one, is that, people are hearing what they want to hear from the supposed radio waves or from the supposed white noise. Like I said, this one I kind of agree with. In case you don't know, pareidolia is a situation where our brains are trying to make sense of random messages or random noises or random pictures even. So it's attempting to put them into a pattern that makes sense. So this goes beyond just the paranormal EVPs. This is, seeing a face on the moon, seeing a face in a wall, like where your mind is trying to make sense of patterns. Even if the patterns are completely random, your mind tries to make sense of it. And so for me, this is, when a paranormal investigator claims, oh, they heard the word demon through the radio waves, when no one else watching actually heard that word the first time. But as soon as they say, oh, that's what the word said, now that's all you can hear, right? So your brain is helping you hear that. It's kind of this, in my opinion, the same idea with lyrics. I don't know if you've ever heard, I'm sure you've heard someone, say the wrong lyrics to a song. And then as soon as you hear the wrong lyrics, when you go to listen to the song again, that's all you can hear is the wrong lyrics. You can no longer hear the right lyrics. So it's kind of the same idea. They put that word into your mind and now that's all you can hear whenever you hear that particular EVP. And then, of course, related to pareidolia is apophenia. So apophenia is a spontaneous finding of connections or meaning in random, unconnected, or meaningless things. So this would be, an investigator goes in asking specific questions about a murder that they know happened in the house, and suddenly they get all of this evidence pointing to the murder happening or pointing to who they think the murderer is, and the evidence is exactly what they think it was going to be. So, you're kind of going in with this thought in mind, and then suddenly all the evidence you hear supports it, right? So, or, oh, it's got to be a demon in the house, and then suddenly all these evil things come through the EVP. It's kind of, you're putting that message in your mind, and our brains start to search for those connections, making us believe that this is actually true, right? Which reminds me of an episode I watched where two well-known paranormal investigators had been asked to go to a specific location where they felt the activity was starting to get really negative because there's some local hobby paranormal investigators that had been starting to get some really negative stuff through EVPs. And so they wanted these experts to come in and just see what their take was on it and what they should do about it. And however, when the experts actually listened to the supposed EVPs of this negative stuff, their take on it was, oh, that's just a jacket rubbing together near the speaker, or, it wasn't actually a voice. If you want to know the show, it was Kindred Spirits, one of my favorites, with Amy Bruni and Adam Berry. They're one of the few paranormal investigators that I actually, believe some of the stuff that they get, just because I enjoy the way they investigate. Likely because they don't call every ghost a demon, but that is a topic I could probably spend a lot of hours talking about, so we won't get into that here. Of course, now we're talking about the digital age, right? Because that's what we're currently in. Everyone owns cell phones. There are even more attempts to capture EVP. I've even tried out one of the apps that you can download, on your phone now for free, to attempt to communicate with the spirits through your cell phone. Unfortunately, I think this will only increase the false evidence that people claim to get, making it even harder to pick out what's real evidence versus faked or hoaxes, or just, kind of like the whole jackets making sound on a recording and people mistaking it for a voice. Especially since there are now cell phones everywhere, which have their own kind of radio waves. And on top of that, with the cell phones means we have lots of cell towers, which could also add extra interference to digital recordings as well. And even some investigators try to use walkie-talkies instead of cell phones to, be on a different frequency. But I don't know. I think those will have their own problems, because my kids have walkie-talkies that they play with, and who knows if, they accidentally picked up an investigation, some kids could be trying to play pranks on those people. So I don't know. I have a hard time believing in some of these things. But they do kind of add an extra little ambiance to the episode, I suppose. And don't get me started on the apps that have come out. Maybe there are some that are actually legitimate. I don't know. I tried one out, like I said. I tried it in my basement. We do have activity down there from time to time. So I thought, well, maybe something would actually come through if I actually gave this a try. Previous to me trying it, it was never mean. It was never mean-spirited. It was never, bad activity. It was just random activity that we would get as, seemed like a ghost was just saying, hey, I'm here. But I took the app down there, turned it on, just to see what voices might come through. And instantly I was getting told to get out and that evil was there. And yeah, right. So all of this to say that, just like everything we talk about when we're discussing potential hoaxes, be careful what you believe in. Personally, I feel like those apps are probably pre-programmed with certain phrases to utter at random times to attempt to make it seem like you're having a real conversation. But I don't know. Or maybe they're picking up on other technology in the area, as in our house we have multiple computers, we have Wi-Fi, there's cell towers, we're in a city. So who knows what else could be, interfering. But given everything that we've talked about today, what is my take on EVPs? Personally, I would love to be involved in one of the actual experiments in screened rooms, soundproof rooms. I think that would be fascinating, not only to block out the noise, but also block out kind of the potential of radio waves interfering. And being involved with experiments like that, set up in even a haunted building on top of everything, that would be fascinating in my opinion. One day I actually hope to own a haunted building. I don't know if you've ever heard me talk in private, but one of my dreams is to actually own a haunted building and have like a haunted store in it, and maybe a haunted Airbnb, because I think that would be really fun. So then maybe I could have my own experiment, but one day. One thing I do appreciate in the new paranormal investigation shows is actually the attempt to kind of remove some of this pareidolia. I'm never going to get that word right. I'm sorry. Or apophenia from the picture. So in this case, I'm referring to the Estes method, which is, where one investigator is blindfolded and then given noise-canceling headphones that is connected to the spirit box or the ghost box or Frank's box for that matter. And the reason why I like this particular experiment that is getting more and more common in paranormal investigation shows now is that it does kind of try to do some control over, giving our brains the patterns that they're searching for. Of course, we don't know how much prep actually occurs prior to the Estes method being done in these shows, but there does always seem to be some messages that are just very random. which you can ignore. However, periodically they do get some really interesting conversation going between the investigator asking the questions and the investigator that's actually under the Estes method. Like I said, kindred spirits is one that they do this particular method a lot, and I really enjoy watching them. And so I'd love to see more experiments done with that method, and especially if you could do it in those controlled screen rooms that we talked about earlier. I think that would be fascinating to learn what we get from that. And just like everything we talk about, I do have a hard time believing the television shows and YouTube channels with some of their evidence. Even if they don't realize it, they are likely interpreting noise and random messages as meaning more than they actually do. If you can do more scientific experiments in more controlled environments, like they're doing in universities, that I now wish I had attended when I was younger, then I would absolutely love to hear the evidence that they are collecting. I do appreciate, though, like I said, when investigators try the Estes method at least, because it does feel a little bit more scientific and controlled. However, probably still not as controlled as a science experiment would be. But I don't know. What do you think? I'd love to hear your opinions on EVPs and the supposed evidence that is captured by this method. One day I hope to conduct some of my own experiments, so perhaps that will be a future series on my YouTube or something, because that would be very fun. And you know what? I think we covered a lot today, and it's probably time to wrap up. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, kind of diving into EVPs and, that portion of the paranormal investigations. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you know any other evidence that is hard to debunk, then connect with me and let me know. Or, like I said, if you know anyone conducting these experiments that's looking for an extra scientist to help out, tell them to look me up. Thank you for joining us tonight. Don't forget, if you'd like to support the show, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. I also have a Patreon for those that want behind-the-scenes information, extra content, and a chance to join a live Q&A with me each month. Next week, we have another guest joining us. I'm excited to introduce you to the person behind the pen name H.P. Bain, the author of the Sullivan Gray Paranormal Mystery series. Make sure you join us next week as we talk about writing paranormal characters, as well as interest in the paranormal that brought her to write about it. And don't forget, Coma, my debut supernatural horror novel, has been released, so you can check it out on Amazon, or there's a couple online stores that have it. You just have to look up Coma by K.D. Kulpa, and you will find me. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is K.D. Kulpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.